grade. Welcome back. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be reviewing the plant kingdom. Specifically, we're going to be going over nomenclature and taxonomy. In other words, how plants are named, how they're classified. Now, we've already gone through these notes in class, and you have this note packet with you. It should be in your notebook. If it's not, make sure you put it there. But nonetheless, this is just kind of a review because it's been a while since we've actually been in class, so we could talk about these things. And so we're just going to go ahead and we're going to kind of review these basics of what makes up a plant and how do we divide the plant kingdom. So before we actually get started in that, we have to remember that there are actually 6 kingdoms of life. Now, this is somewhat debated on how these are actually divided. Some say that, for instance, our archaea bacteria and eubacteria are not necessarily kingdoms, but they're their own domains of life. In other words, archaea is so different from eubacteria that some scientists don't even consider them true bacteria. However, nonetheless, for our intensive purposes, we just consider these 2 different kingdoms of life. Then you also had the protista, and those were those weird things that were kind of like fungus, but kind of like plants, and kind of like animals, all in one. I like to call it the junk drawer of life, simply because there's just so many weird things. Now, this is also, before we go on, I just want to mention that this is where we found algae. A lot of times you guys might hear people refer to algae as a plant, but it is technically not a plant, and we're going to see why here in just a second. And so we got your 2 kingdoms of bacteria, protista. You have fungi, which for the longest time were actually classified with plants until we started to look at their cell structure and we realized that they were not really plant-like. They might have a cell wall like plants, but it's made out of totally different materials. They don't get their resources from the same places that plants do, and so they have their own life cycle and everything. They're their own group. And then, of course, we have Animalia, which is where all animals fit into. And last but not least, what we're going to be talking about today, Kingdom Plantae. All right. Now, what makes up a plant? Some of you guys might say that if it has a stem, leaves, roots, then it's a plant. However, if you guys remember, we talked about some plants that actually don't have these characteristics. And so trying to define what a plant is can be kind of tricky from time to time. But in general, we would say that plants are producers. In other words, they're going to make their own energy. They're going to use photosynthesis to make energy from the light, and that energy is going to help them in making sugars. They're going to have cell walls, and these cell walls are going to be made out of cellulose, which is a type of sugar. And another main characteristic is that they're going to have what are called plastids. And when we look at plastids, plastids are going to be things like chloroplast. And this chloroplast is where, of course, photosynthesis takes place. And there are different types of colored plastids that are going to be doing things like photosynthesis, but chloroplast is the main one that we think of. Now, the one thing, if we look at some of the things in Kingdom Protista, it would meet these criteria. They have cell walls. The cell walls are made out of cellulose. It's a producer, and it's using plastids to do that. However, what distinguishes algae from actually being a plant is the fact that algae is single cellular. Yes, we might find it in colonies, but these colonies are just groups of single-celled organisms that live together in large groups. So your plants are going to have all these characteristics, but they're also going to be multicellular. That's the key, is that plants are going to be multicellular. So, as we start to go through our nomenclature and taxonomy of Kingdom Plantae, it's important that we remember our good King Philip came over for good spaghetti. And what I mean by that is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. However, if you look at this diagram here, you don't see phylum. Instead, we have what are called divisions. And that's, again, one of the tricky parts about classifying plants. For whatever reason, botanists like to sometimes put them into divisions instead of phylums. It's the same thing, however, it's just called a division instead. And so, as you can see here in this chart, it can get pretty confusing because now we're not just going to be dealing with kingdoms, phylums, class, orders, and whatnot. We're going to be dealing with kingdoms, subkingdoms, superdivisions, and so it can kind of get confusing from time to time, which is why I want you guys to map it out. Now, you should already have this map in your notebooks, but if you don't, go ahead, pause the screen right now, and I want you guys to write out this diagram in your notebook. These are the classifications that we are going to be going through today. We're going to be talking about how plants are either going to be vascular or non-vascular. That's going to be the broadest categories. And then from those broad categories, we're going to kind of narrow it down to plants with seeds and seedless plants, which again is still a broad category. From there, we're going to narrow down those plants that do have seeds into types known as angiosperms and gymnosperms. And then last but not least, we're going to look at these angiosperms, whether they're a monocot or a dicot. And this should all make sense by the end of this video. So again, if you haven't written this down in your notebook, go ahead, pause this right now, and I want you to do that until we do that, and then you can move on in this video. All right, so our first grouping, our first two broad groups of plants are either the ones that are going to be vascular or non-vascular. And these are the questions that I want you to think of. They're kind of obvious, so if you think something, you're probably right about it. So first of all, how could you tell the difference between a vascular plant and a non-vascular plant? And again, something to help you with this, remember, what were vascular bundles for? We talked about vascular bundles in the last chapter. And then last but not least, of these two plants, vascular and non-vascular, which ones do you think are going to be the taller ones? Why don't you go ahead and pause this for a second, think about these questions, write down your answer, and then go on with the video. All right, so of course, these vascular plants have vascular tissue. That's pretty much how you can tell these apart. Now, you don't have to put it under a microscope to figure out if a plant is going to have vascular tissue. Remember what we talked about with vascular bundles? These vascular bundles are what give the plant support. They're also what produce the veins in a leaf. And so you can just take one quick glance at a plant and you can see, does it have a tall stem? In other words, is it at least a couple inches off the ground? And does it have leaves? If it has leaves, do you see veins in that leaf? Do you see a certain type of venation, the way those veins are structured? Those veins are the vascular bundles. And so again, when you're trying to figure out if you're looking at a vascular plant or a non-vascular plant, look for veins, look for a stem. If it's a tall plant, it's going to be vascular. All right? So what about the non-vascular plants then? Well, non-vascular plants are mainly going to be things like your true mosses, and then other plants like liverworts. They don't have any vascular tissue, and so they're not going to have xylem or phloem, which is able to carry nutrients and water to really, really high places. Like you can see these trees in the background. They would be vascular plants because those entire trunks of the trees are made up of xylem and phloem vascular bundles that are transporting nutrients sometimes over 200 feet up into the air. And these plants don't have that luxury. And so they're going to have to stay closer to the ground. They're going to have to stay close to a water source because, again, they can't get that nutrients from deep in the soil and they can't pull it up very far. They're relying on diffusion to get their water. If you don't remember what diffusion is, think of like a can of Lysol when you spray that, or when somebody does something in class that doesn't smell well. I think you can figure out what I'm talking about. And at first you don't smell it because you're on the other side of the class. But all of a sudden, it finally comes to you. And that's because those molecules are doing what's called diffusion. They're being transported through the air. All right? That's how these plants rely on getting their water and other nutrients, is through that process of diffusion. Because they do not have vascular tissue to help them with this process, they're going to rely on that. And so they need to be close to their water source. Likewise, they're going to be found in the shade. And the reason that they're going to be found in these shady areas, we talked about this in class, and I was very proud of you guys. You were able to infer, just with the information that you had, well, if they have to diffuse their water and they have to be near that water source, if they're somewhere where it's bright and sunny, that water source is probably going to dry up very quickly, which is exactly why they're going to be found in shady places, which is why you're going to find them generally in places that look like a forest like this. Sometimes you might hear people say that look for moss on the north side of a tree. And the reason they say that is because, again, the north side of the tree is not going to get as much sun because the way our sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And so generally you will have more moss growing on that side of the tree. And so again, it's all because that's the shadier place. It's probably going to stay a little bit damper, a little bit moister. And those are your general characteristics when we're talking about these non-vascular plants. So again, what are non-vascular plants? They're what we call the true mosses. So these true mosses, these bryophytes and your liverworts, they don't have general plant organs, or what we think of as being the plant tissues, like seeds or leaves or roots or even stems, because all those plant organs are made with vascular tissue. And so the fact that we don't have that vascular tissue in these plants, they're not going to be able to grow those. But remember, they still meet all the other characteristics. They're going to be producing their own food. They have that cell wall. They have plastids, and they are multicellular. So again, these are your mosses. And some of you might be wondering, what in the world is this going on here? This is a picture, if you guys remember, I talked about it in class. I just wanted to show you, there's a type of moss known as peat moss. And there are these places called peat bogs where it would grow a lot and you'd have almost like a swampy area. And sometimes when people would die and they would fall into these peat bogs, the peat moss itself actually acts as a little preservative. And so it would preserve these people, almost like mummifying them. And so that's just one of the things that you can see where it's like, because of just the way peat moss works, its acidity and what happens to it with the soil, it actually can become a preservative for other things as well. So that's just one of the uses of these non-vascular plants. All right, so now we're going to be moving on from our vascular plants, or from our non-vascular plants, into the vascular plants. And as you can see here, vascular plants make up the rest of the plant kingdom. And so we're going to look to our chart again. We've gone through our plants. We just talked about the non-vascular. Now we're going to talk about vascular. And again, here you can see from our subkingdom going down to our superdivision, we're going to have what are known as seedless vascular plants and seed-bearing vascular plants. So first of all, let's go ahead and we're going to look at those seedless vascular plants. These are going to be things like ferns, horsetails, which are these right here, and your club mosses. And these are, of course, going to have that vascular tissue, and they're going to have your true plant organs. They're going to have stems, which is what we see here with the horsetails. They're going to have leaves, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to see on a horsetail, but the leaves would come out here. This would be where the node is at. It's very obvious on ferns. These are what we call fronds. That's the type of leaf that a fern has. However, they don't have seeds, and so these are what we call seedless vascular plants. Instead, they are going to reproduce with spores. And the way they do this is going to be different than even how your mosses would reproduce. Again, I didn't mention it in the video here, or when we were on the slide, but your non-vascular plants, because they don't have seeds, they're going to be reproducing with spores as well. And so when our fern decides to reproduce, you're going to notice these little dots all on the underside of the frond. So again, this is a type of compound leaf that we see here, this frond. Right here, this rhizome, that's actually the stem. It's generally going to be found underground, but that is nonetheless the stem. and these would be like the little roots. But again, you're going to have these spores, these little dots that you see on the fern, those are the spores. And so eventually this fern will release its spores, and those spores will generally turn into what's known as a gametophyte. And this gametophyte is not a true fern yet. It's a little plant that has sperm and eggs. And this sperm and eggs, they're going to, of course, fertilize. Now, you're not going to have the fern fertilizing itself. And that's for actually genetic reasons. We won't go into detail, but nonetheless, you're actually going to have one mature gametophyte meet with another mature gametophyte. They're going to find each other on the ground somewhere. Eventually, they're going to there's going to be some water that gets these gametophytes wet, and that's going to allow the sperm to transfer to the eggs with fertilization, and then you're going to get your true fern starting out. And then that cycle continues over and over again. And that's the general process for reproduction with these seedless vascular plants. Again, vascular because we have our leaf, we have our stem, we have our roots, but we don't have seeds. So these are the seedless vascular plants. All right. And of course, just like we had our division, we said vascular plants were all the plants. We're going to have another split when we talk about the seed plants. And so as you can see here, the rest of the time we're going to be talking about these seed plants, which again are going to be divided. This is where we're finally getting to our main divisions. And again, there are other divisions for seedless plants. We're just not going to be talking about them here. We're going to be talking about the seed plants from now on. So we have our angiosperms and our gymnosperms. Let's just take another minute. Again, if you did not do this already, make sure that you have this down. We've talked about our non-vascular plants. We're talking about our vascular plants. We just talked about the seedless plants. Now we're talking about those with seeds. And so, again, the division we're talking about now, our seed-bearing plant, that's going to be the angiosperms and the gymnosperms. And these are going to be the two large divisions. These are probably what we're primarily going to see when you look around outside your house to look for plants. It's either going to be an angiosperm or a gymnosperm. You may find a few seedless plants, and you may even find just a few vascular plants. But again, we see this superabundance of angiosperms and gymnosperms, and especially angiosperms now. There's a plethora of just different types of flowering plants. And I know I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because we haven't really discussed what a flowering plant is yet. So let's do that. All right, so we have our gymnosperms and our angiosperms. Basically, gymnosperms are going to be plants that have cones, things like pine trees. They're not going to have a flower or a fruit to them, you could say. While your angiosperms, they will have flowers, and that's the easiest way to remember if you're looking at a gymnosperm or an angiosperm. Is it going to reproduce using a cone, or is it going to reproduce using a flower? And again, you guys might remember the little mnemonic device I gave you guys to remember this. If you didn't, it was that our friend Jim here, Jim likes pine-scented deodorant. He works out at the gym, and he's going to use that pine-scented deodorant. So that's because that's what Jim likes. So that's the gymnosperm. Meanwhile, Angie here loves flowers. So Jim likes the pine-scented deodorant, and Angie loves flowers. That's our gymnosperms and our angiosperms. So we should be on the second page of our notes, where it says vascular plants with seeds divided into two more groups. That's what I want you to write. Is that gymnosperms are cone-bearing, angiosperms have flowers. You could even write this mnemonic device out there if you want to. All right, so the gymnosperms. Like I said, these are going to be our cone-bearing plants. This is actually in Arizona. This is what's known as the Mogollon Rim. And here we can see a lot of pine trees. I honestly forget the type of species of pine these are, but nonetheless, these are gymnosperms, and it was very easy to tell because they all use cones to reproduce. Uh, the true meaning of gymnosperm, it's Latin for naked seed. All right, that's where this gymno refers to naked, and sperm refers to seed. That's what the Latin actually means. And so these are going to be things like your conifers. All right, again, remember, conifer is cone bearing. So these are things like pine trees, Christmas trees. Those would be your conifers, spruce trees, your ginkgos, which this thing right here is a ginkgo tree. And again, it's actually too warm here in Florida for us to be able to see a ginkgo tree live. They like a colder climate, but nonetheless, these are ginkgo trees. Sometimes they're considered one of those living fossils because we can find ginkgo leaves in the fossil record from a long, long time ago. And so they're considered like a living fossil. Another one that we're going to see that's considered like a living fossil, if you notice right here, looks like we got a little palm tree. That is not a palm tree. All right, this thing right here is what's known as a cycad. And cycads actually have a big cone that will come out the top here when they reproduce. And so next time maybe you're at Lowe's or Walmart and you look in the flower section, and you might see some of these little palm trees that people are selling for houseplants. And I say palm tree because that's what everybody's going to think it is. It's probably most likely a cycad though. And depending on what time of the year you go into Walmart or to Lowe's to see these, you might even be able to see that cone coming out at the top here. And so these are the cycads. We don't have a lot of species of cycads that are living today. In comparison to what used to be here. You can actually look back in the fossil record and you can see that there used to be giant cycads that lived a long, long time ago. There's a few of them still around. You can see some different videos online about them. But for the most part, you're going to see smaller ones today. So again, our main characteristics, they're not going to have fruits. They're generally going to be cone bearing. That's why they're called naked seeds, because they don't have a fruit. It's just going to be a seed inside of a cone. And they're some of the oldest and the largest plants on the planet. What do I mean by that? Your giant redwoods and sequoias out west. These trees are a type of conifer, and these are the ones that can be over 200 feet tall. They can be just massive, and they can be so large. Again, what we see here is that back in the 1940s, for part of tourism, they would actually cut these holes in the middle of the tree so you could say that you drove through the middle of a tree. These trees are so old. This tree itself was probably just starting to sprout about the time that Jesus was born. All right, so these trees are long-lived trees. Now, before I move on, just a little thing. Sometimes people ask, well, how does this work for the tree? All right, remember our trees are actually living just the outside, that very edge, that sapwood is what's actually alive. The middle, that's that heartwood. That part is actually dead. So yes, it does hurt the tree on the outsides, but cutting out that middle, not so much. However, this isn't something that's good, but nonetheless, it's there. All right, so our angiosperms, the last ones that we're going to cover and the last of our notes today are the angiosperms, and it's going to be what we call our final divide in the plant kingdom, at least that we're going to be talking about. Angiosperm simply refers to a covered seed. Remember, gymnosperm meant naked seed, angio referring to covered, and sperm referring to seed. And these are every single flowering plant on Earth. If you can think of a plant that has a flower, or if you can see a plant and you know it has a flower, it's an angiosperm. Now, what type of angiosperm? That's going to differ. But for the most part, if it has a flower, it's going to be an angiosperm. And this is something, again, if you remember that video we watched, David Attenborough was talking about how this was something that troubled Darwin when he was looking at the fossil record, was just the fact that, you know, if evolution were to be happening, it should happen at a very slow process. but all of a sudden in the fossil records, we just see this literal boom, or this almost like the Cambrian explosion for plants, in the sense that out of nowhere we just have all these flowering plants. It wasn't like we had one flowering plant and they slowly evolved into more and more flowering plants. It was just like all of a sudden there appeared like hundreds and thousands of different species of flowering plants, and Darwin wondered how this could happen. Now, David Attenborough goes on to say that we know today that it was just, it was a lot longer process than Darwin originally thought. However, all right, we as Christians who believe that God created everything and everything with that intended purpose would just look at that explosion, you could say, of flowering plants and be like, well, there's no problem with us for looking at that. We just know that God created all these plants because they had a purpose. All right, if you remember day 3, he creates the flowering plants and all the seed-bearing plants. And so again, these are going to have the specialized organs, because that's what a flower is. And these specialized organs are used for reproduction. That's what we're going to be talking about in our next slideshow that you guys see. We're going to be looking at how these flowers are used to reproduce and make new plants. When you're eating a fruit, you're eating the developed ovaries of a flower. I hate to break it to you, but that's what it is. All right. And so last but not least, our final divide on our map, if you guys should already have this written down, but if not, we're just breaking it down to the class division today. We have what are known as the monocots and the dicots. That's the abbreviated version. Some people will say the full thing, monocotyledon, or cotyledon, however you want to pronounce it, or the dicotyledon. And what this refers to is the cotyledon that a plant is going to have as a seed or as an embryo. This cotyledon is going to be where it gets its first nutrients from as that plant is growing, and also that first initial what appears to be a leaf that comes out. That's actually the kind of like the developed cotyledon. We're going to see that with the monocot, they're going to have like one little leaf that pops out. With the dicot, they're going to have two little leaves that pop out. Because again, monocot, mono means what? Means one. Dicot, di refers to what? Two. And so again, that's how we remember it. Monocot is going to have one. Dicot is going to have two. Now, let's say you're outside looking at a plant, which you should be, and you have to figure out if it's a monocot or a dicot. Let's assume you've already gone through all the other steps. You figured out, yes, it is a vascular plant because 1, it's standing on its own. 2, I can see veins. And 3, it's super tall. All right. So we've already gone through that. We figured out it's a vascular plant. Let's assume that you figured out that it wasn't a fern or a horsetail or something like that, and you know that somehow it's going to have a flower. So how else can we figure it out? Well, we're not going to be taking apart a plant and looking at under a microscope to see how the vascular bundles are structured. That is one way that you can do it. All right, but you're not going to have to. Likewise, we probably should not be pulling up these plants from the ground. The only way I would suggest doing that is if it's a weed in your front yard, or even better, if it's an invasive plant that doesn't belong here in Florida anyway. We talked about Caesar weed when we did this as a class. But that's the only time you should be taking it up to look at the roots. And so for the most part, what you're going to be looking at to determine, am I looking at a monocot or a dicot, it's either going to be the flowers or the leaves. And again, I'm going to say primarily stick with the leaves because in most cases, now we're getting lucky because it is around springtime, so you may see some flowers, but in most cases, you're just going to be looking at these leaves. So again, super easy. Just look at the leaf. And again, here it says veins are usually parallel. Remember, we talked about the different types of venation. All right. Here we have, what is this? What type of venation is this? All right, it's all coming from the middle and branching out. And if you said palmate, you would be correct. Here it says net-like. This is palmate. Now, let's assume that this right here was just one leaf, and it had that one main vein coming off, and it had the little ones branching off, then that would be pinnate. Nonetheless, if it's palmate or pinnate, it's most likely going to be a dicot. If it has parallel veins, it's most likely going to be a monocot. So again, if you see something with parallel veins like grass, it's a monocot. Parallel veins like bamboo, monocot. Bamboo is a type of grass. What about palm trees, which technically aren't trees? They're a type of grass. They have parallel venation on their fronds or their palms, and so they're a monocot. And so it's super easy. Just look at the veins. If it has parallel, it's most likely a monocot. If it has anything other than parallel, it's most likely a dicot. So again, look at the veins. If it is a weed and you pull it out, look at the roots. If you see that one main taproot, it's probably a dicot. If you see a bunch of roots, it's going to be most likely a monocot. If you actually see a flower on it, you can go ahead and count the petals on the flower, and that should generally tell you sometimes. If it's in multiples of 3, like we have here, it's most likely going to be a monocot. If it's in multiples of 4 or 5, it's most likely going to be a dicot. Now, again, this isn't foolproof either, because what if your flower has, let's say, 15 petals? All right, well, 15 is not just a multiple of 5, but it could be a multiple of 3 as well. And so then you would have to look at other characteristics, whether it's the roots or the leaves. And again, I'm always going to push you guys to look towards the leaves instead. So I hope this helps you with your video or with your little lab that you guys have to do. Again, I want you to go outside. I want you to take that Kingdom Plantae paper. Some of you guys may already have it in your notebooks. If so, just add to that one. But I want you to go outside and find at least 8 different plants. You might not know the name of the plant, and that's okay, at least for right now. I want you to go and try and find it later, but I do want you to try and identify what venation you see on the plant. Is it a vascular plant or a non-vascular plant? If it's a vascular plant, is it a gymnosperm or an angiosperm? And if it's an angiosperm, a monocot or a dicot? And then just tell me where you found it. Again, that can all be found on your little chart there. If you are having trouble figuring out what the name of the plant is, and you have some free space on your phone or tablet, a great resource will be what's called PlantID. It's a free app that allows you to scan the leaves, and again, based off the venation, they're going to be able to tell you what it is. And the app, again, it's not PlantID, it's PlantSnap. All right, PlantSnap allows you to do up to 5 plants a day, and that's not mandatory. You do not have to download the app, but it's a great resource if you want to look at it. So I hope this helps you today, and I'll talk to you guys later.